big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Well, hi everybody, it's David Leis here. A warm welcome to all of you on this June the 27th, 2024, the year of our Lord. Do you have a friend who has a unique combination of analytical insight across a variety of topics, who's a brilliant writer and I didn't want to say a comedian, but someone who's quite witty and funny? Well, that would describe my special guest today, and I'm very excited to have him. That is John Robson, and a warm welcome to you, John.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, John, you are certainly one of these special people that brings a lot of clarity and insight to things, and I'm excited to introduce you to our audience. And speaking of which, I am so appreciative of the comments we get from so many people across the country about the kinds of issues that we talk about. So on that note, as we cover a lot of different topics today, call them interesting topics, hot topics, whatever you want to refer to in terms of these policy items, they do matter. And so I'm really glad that our audience, you could join us on all the platforms and have this live discussion. So we welcome your questions. That's very important. We welcome them very much. So John, it's great to see you again, my friend. You are very busy as a author, a columnist, and you do an awful lot of work. Would you say that writing takes up most of your time? John, can you tell us more about how you spend your time?
In one sense, definitely yes. I write newspaper columns and other pieces, and also write the newsletter for the Climate Discussion Nexus. It's the foundation of our videos. But in another sense, the amazement and dismay of my teenagers, I'm actually a successful YouTuber. We've had nearly 11 million views for the Climate Discussion Nexus over the last 6 years. And so in some sense, I think you could say that I spend most of my time as a talking head online, and that I, of all people, should have prevailed in social media is odd, because I am, in fact, the least cool person in the world. It's not just my kids who think so. I genuinely am. And yet we're so grateful. Everybody watches, shares the videos, and we're really getting the word out to where people are. And that is the essence of successful communication. The newsletter is great too, and everyone should subscribe to it. But the videos are the thing that just seems to have really hit the spot.
No, that's tremendous. So I do recommend John's videos at Climate Nexus. I find them very informative. Why do you think they've taken off so well, John? Like, what? Can you tell us more about where we can find those?
Yes, you can. Our website is climatediscussionnexus.com, and you can go there, and the videos are there. And we're on YouTube as Climate DN. And I think that there are several things. The first thing is that we have done our very best to tell the truth and to make sure that we understand the issue and figure out what matters, and then present it in a clear and comprehensible manner. But there's also something. My mother taught history at the University of Toronto for many years, and she said that she always tried to make her lectures entertaining, even funny, because she said there's sort of this tactical consideration that people remember things better if they laugh while hearing them. But also, she said, I'm taking an hour out of people's lives 3 times a week that they can never get back, and I really want them to enjoy it, to mark respect for them, that learning from me should not be an ordeal. And I think that our videos captivate people because they're entertaining. And the other side of that, which again is very important in these troubled times, is that we're not afraid. We're not grim. We don't like we were eating lemons backstage. There's an important public policy battle to be won here, and we are delighted to be in a position to help win it.
Well, I think you're right on, John. How do we communicate well, challenging topics, but in a way that people can understand? We don't have to do that with fear or trepidation. We can do that. I think I've never met your mom, but I think I would like her as a professor, John.
Yes, well, unfortunately, it is no longer possible to meet her, at least in this world. But yeah, she was a superb teacher. She was that was really what she did best. And as I say, she enjoyed doing it, and her students came out wiser and also, I think, to some extent, happier.
Well, that's really touching. So, John, we've got a lot of topics to cover today, and certainly with our audience, we welcome again your questions about what you want to talk about. And there's just, gosh, every day it's kind of a waterfall of issues approaching us. So, one of the things I wanted to do is talk about some big news that happened this week, which was the by-election in the St. Paul's riding in Toronto. I'm actually fairly familiar with that riding. It's a very interesting riding. But let's just hear this clip as we think about what are the implications of this significant election that the Conservatives won.
Win in a by-election this week has put pressure on the Prime Minister. While the vote won't change the balance of power in Ottawa, it was viewed as a key test for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. CTV's Judy Trin has more on the fallout.
So over here. At this meeting of the country's environment ministers, conservation is on the agenda, but it's the preservation of power that dominates questions.
I know enough about politics that one should be careful by drawing direct links between a by-election and a general election.
The Liberals are on shaky ground after a Toronto stronghold was breached by a Conservative win. Behind the scenes, at least 4 Liberal MPs have told CTV News Justin Trudeau should step down. But the public message is different.
I think he's the best place to beat Pierre Poilievre, who, as I've said publicly, is a fake. He doesn't present any concrete vision of Canada that I support. It's a guy full of slogans.
Pierre Poilievre's messages are resonating, especially the promise to get rid of the carbon tax if elected. But Liberal strategists say changing the party's key climate policy won't help.
Justin Trudeau's put his whole reputation around the carbon tax, about taking action on fighting carbon and climate change. And so I think where they back off on that, they look like hypocrites.
The New Democrats are also struggling to stop the Conservative momentum. They only got 10% of the votes in the Toronto St. Paul's by-election, in a riding they hold provincially.
Then Liberals and Conservatives rewrote the rules.
To boost support, the NDP are spending money on national ads.
For the first time in almost a decade, we will be going into this campaign debt-free. We've been debt-free for a while now, so we're building up a war chest.
Right now, the NDP are propping up the minority government. The confidence agreement to support the Liberals expires in June 2025. An election has to be held by fall of next year. So, John, not a lot of time to win over voters seeking change.
So there you have it, John. There's a bit of an overview about the election follow-up from that by-election. So what do you think is the message there? What comes to your mind when you look at those results?
In fact, I find these results encouraging on several levels. One being that I think that this Trudeau administration is a disaster for the country, so they've got to go. But it also confirms something that Jay Budziszewski said. He's a philosopher at the University of Texas. He was an existential atheist, and then he found Christ, or Christ found him, and he's become a very wise commentator. And when he was talking once about slippery slopes, and he said, some will object that people aren't logical that way, but he said they are. They're just logical slowly. And I think you're seeing that people in Canada, including those who would naturally be Liberal voters or NDP voters, are realizing we're on the wrong track. There's ridings that the Liberals could lose and say, oh, well, about the deplorables out that way. But in this riding, and if I'm right about the boundaries, speaking of my mother, I grew up in what's now part of that riding. This is not a riding where the Conservatives normally do well. And I would like to add as a side note that Jagmeet Singh is a licensed buffoon, to borrow a phrase from Sapper, that he is forever telling people how terrible the Liberals are, how awful they abuse power. They're on the side of the ultra-rich, and I'm keeping them in power. And at a certain point, people think, you're just an idiot. If you get that obvious political thing that wrong, nothing else that you say is interesting. But people understand, whether Pierre Poilievre is really in a position to change the direction of government in this country. He makes the right noises, but when you try and press him, say federal spending was under 300 billion when Justin Trudeau became prime minister. It's now about 500 billion. What's your plan to get it back under 3? Or, do you think that there is a man-made climate crisis or things like that? You try and pin them down in fundamentals, you don't get very far. But people are they've had it with the Liberals, and the more the Liberals talk about, the voters don't understand us, the voters don't appreciate us, the worse they make things. They're so out of touch that they don't even know they're out of touch. And these are dying days for this regime.
Okay, so you see it as a signal, if you will, that this is the dying days of a regime. So can you help us understand what's your theory on why so many Canadians have given up on the Trudeau Liberal policies?
I think there are several factors that reinforce. The first one, obvious one, again, about people being logical slowly, everything they touch turns to lead. All the things they promised us they would make better, they have made worse. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at things like balancing the budget or keeping inflation low that might not be traditional Liberal concerns. But even you go to things like housing, complete debacle. They haven't made progress on the social issues. Their dental plan, no dentist wants to join. Their highly touted climate plan hasn't reduced emissions. Our standing in the world was completely hopeless even before we found out that there's subversion within our parliament. And they're just like, we're not going to tell you the names. That wouldn't be responsible. It's like, wait, you know about this. You know who these people are. Some of them are probably in your caucus and you're hiding it from us. So it doesn't matter where you look. Their performance is a disaster. It's not that 6 things are going right for every 5 that are going wrong. It's a complete nightmare. And the other thing that I suspect is more important than they realize is that Trudeau sold himself to us on his sunny ways. He was meant to be the nice guy, the smiling, high road, cheerful, generous guy. But in fact, he's mean as a junkyard dog. He's forever snarling at people, calling them, saying they take up space, calling them racist and sexist and absolutely abusive language, not to mention elbowing MPs because they didn't vote the way he wanted when he wanted them to, throwing people out of his caucus or out of his cabinet if they dare to defy him. He's proven himself to be a nasty as well as a narcissistic person. And I think that over time, that is sinking in, that he's just not a nice guy. And since far too many people vote on whether a politician is nice rather than whether they're competent and sensible, the fact that he's shown that he's not nice, I think, is really hurting him.
Okay, so that I think that's an interesting perspective, that over time people do figure it out. There's a kind of a logic that people realize, and they're kind of coming to the realization that this government is really not serving them as Canadians. I think that's an interesting perspective on this whole thing. So out of this, do you think that there's an increased possibility that the Prime Minister will actually resign and kind of try to resuscitate the Liberal Party?
I don't think so, and partly because he has a very inflated view of himself. Where exactly he gets the idea that he's the indispensable man, I cannot imagine, but he does have it very strongly. And when he's been asked, I couldn't be the kind of man I am and walk away from this fight, which is a very revealing way of putting it. It's not to do with policies or the nation. It's about him and this need to win. But the other thing is, if you were a Liberal, you'd say to yourself, Brand Trudeau is just trashed. Who wants to step in and lose the election for him? No, let him take the loss, and then we'll pick a new leader and rebuild. You'd have to be quite the fool to be a Liberal and say, yeah, I'd like to lead us into the next election. The election after next, oh yes, that might look appealing, especially if you think that Poilievre is going to prove to be a great disappointment. But I don't think the Liberals want Trudeau out, partly because they want him to take one for the team, which is not, again, exactly his typical modus operandi, but maybe out of egotism, he'll do it by mistake.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And John, you've alluded to this, but our country, I'm not trying to sound overly dramatic, but there's so much evidence regarding this, is in deep trouble. I mean, I think of the level of deficit spending, accumulated debt, but also the standard of living, as that's, the whole decline of our productivity numbers is really concerning. And I think Canadians feel this every day as they look at, trying to make ends meet. I mean, the whole carbon tax on April 1 I just hear so many complaints anecdotally from people, and I think that you have the numbers are really quite stunning about how people are just really struggling to earn a living. The middle class seems like it's being decimated. So is that kind of a decent summary of the state of our nation here, John, and the need for getting it back on track?
I think it's far too cheerful a picture, but not entirely unreasonable. And, in my darker moments, I think Canada is proof that people don't want to be happy. Because it's hard to imagine a nation more blessed by history and geography
Yes,
and culture,
indeed.
everything. We had everything going for us. And what did we do with it? We've turned ourselves into an international joke. We have no military capacity. We are not trusted by our allies, and rightly not. Our economy's falling apart. We're letting in far too many immigrants. We can't possibly absorb them even residentially, never mind culturally. I mean, it's great that
Right.
people want to come to Canada. Again, I can't knock immigrants. My mother was an immigrant, but they come here because Canada's already a great place, not because it's so awful that we need to bring in people with totally different values to revamp it. And I noticed, by the way, that when I log into my banking, the bank website, the ads increasingly now feature a happy young, what should I call them, multicultural couple, as in non-white, taking a selfie of themselves in their new and spacious house. And this is a classic aspiration that, of course, is increasingly impossible to achieve. And that's why polls show that even immigrants now think that there are too many people immigrating to Canada. Once they get here, their incentives change. And of course, what they want is to be able to afford a house, raise their kids in a pleasant and spot, with a backyard and room. They don't want this trendy urban infill where we're all packed in giant steel and concrete towers. So even the immigrant experience has gone sour in Canada. Everything just about in this country doesn't work anymore, including the water mains. And if we can squander what we had, I mean, there are some countries in the world, without meaning to be rude about them, but where if you heard something terrible had happened, their governance had collapsed, the economy was a mess, you'd think, well, yes, that is rather how things go there. But for Canada to have made such trouble for itself out of the most unpromising material, geographically secure, protected by the United States, the most benign empire and the most powerful one the world has ever seen, a productive, energetic people, kind and generous. We had everything going for us, and look what we've done with it. It's just preposterous.
So what the heck happened? I think you're right. We've inherited an incredible country of both values and compassion and tolerance, but also the rule of law, all kinds of traditions that really enable us to succeed. So what's going on here? What's your theory on that, John?
It seems to be that it's a long crisis. As you may know, I did a documentary on the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. And the Great War was a terrible blow to the self-esteem of the Western world, to its confidence in the fundamental soundness of its values and its ideas. And as so often, in the long run, it's ideas that matter. And then you also had this discovery in the 1950s and 1960s of profound racial injustice in the Western world, that we thought we were the land of fair play and judging everybody on the basis of their character and their abilities. And so it really did. We did need a painful reexamination to ask how these things could happen, but it got out of hand. People decided that the problem with the West isn't that it didn't always live up to its ideals. It's the West was rotten through and through. And you see this in a person like Justin Trudeau, who's received all the benefits Western civilization could possibly bestow on a person. And fundamentally, you have to say he hates the West. He hates Canada. He's not standing by Israel. He is, when churches are burned, he's just like, yeah, well, that's understandable. He doesn't believe in the free enterprise system. He says he's a Roman Catholic, but clearly has no knowledge of the tenets of that faith, let alone interest in obeying them. In so many ways, he's anti-Western without being very intelligent about it, but his reflexes are all that way. And so everything that made Canada, Canada, they work to undermine, deliberately or otherwise, because they just have this revolt of the elites, deep-seated hatred of the West. And the rest of us need to get back our confidence. We don't want to become bigots or, shallow tin horns or anything of that sort. We have to understand that humans are flawed and our civilization has its defects and we must be alert to them. But we need to be willing to say, stop tearing it down. No more toppling statues of John A. Macdonald. No more toppling statues of Queen Victoria. These are among the most outstanding leaders that humanity has ever seen, and they're a lot better than the ones we have now. And without needing to be blind to their failings or persist in things that we shouldn't be doing, we need to get back to saying, you know what? Free enterprise, intact families, a robust national defense, love of God and country. These are the things that make a country a magnet for immigrants. And when you discard them, it just, everything falls apart, big and small.
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, you wrote I thought, a brilliant column. It was featured in the Epoch Times just this week. It's called "There's Hope of Saving Western Civilization, which is declining by choice, not fate." So you think there's a choice going on here. We don't have to decline, but there's certain parties, the so-called elites perhaps, that want to choose to decline. I mean, is that what you're saying in the column here?
Yeah, no, well, they don't want to decline. They just have the wrong idea about what creates flourishing. But again, as I said, ideas have consequences. It's a very important title of a book by Richard Weaver. And there's a line from Tony Robbins. I'm not like a big fan of success gurus, but Robbins was always very tall. And since I've always wanted to be tall, I thought, let's read his book. And he said, don't walk around having ideas stick to you like flypaper. Choose your ideas. And so at this conference, we've got a bunch of speakers to talk about all kinds of different things, from economic to foreign policy to cultural, and say, we have adopted, often unreflectively, ideas that undermine the foundations of a good society. And we need to change our ideas. And then we need to speak up for the ideas that we think are best. And we can turn this around. We can reclaim our country and our civilization. We can make Canada a great country again, including for the newcomers who are being disappointed terribly by what they thought they were going to get instead of what they're actually getting. Now, I don't include in that the people who are supporting Hamas. They can go right back to the terrible place they came from and keep making it terrible. But most people who come to Canada are not in that category. And yes, this is, by the way, that we're having a conference. It's on the 5th and 6th of July. It's out in Red Deer. But we'll also be doing it virtually, of course. And if anybody's interested in that, they go to freedomtalk.ca and they can sign up. Because we think the decline of the West is real and scary, but we do not think it's inevitable. We believe we can turn this around, and we are going to do everything in our power to make that happen.
I like your thinking, John. We can turn it around. And clearly, we've got to be thinking in terms of awareness about these issues, what's going on. And it strikes me that one of the things that's happened, and I've certainly had an up close seat when it comes to universities and other educational institutions, but are they not the fountainheads of a lot of this nonsense? I mean, I'm amazed at how many faculties I look at that are dominated by cultural Marxists. And I'm not making this up. You just look through the roster. This is how they self-describe themselves. They see themselves as Marxists. And hey, that's great to have a variety of perspectives. I get that. But that's not, why would you have faculties that are just dominated by Marxists? So is that part of the problem as you see it? Is our universities are kind of off the rails?
Our universities are completely off the rails. It's been a long process. My father was a university administrator in the early 1970s. He actually had Bob Ray and Michael Ignatieff as student activists on his watch, and I can tell you it aged him prematurely. And things have gotten so much worse since. In fact, I was in academia for a couple of years. I taught at the University of Calgary 1 year as a sessional. And at the end of the year, I went to my department chairman and said, I would love to stay, and I like the city and I like the university and so on. And he said, well, actually, if I'd known you were conservative, I wouldn't have hired you. And I said, I thought this was an extraordinary admission. And he said,
Seriously?
no, it's not about right or left. It's just that
And
we
this
don't like
is-
people who are strongly
this is at
ideological.
the University of
University
Calgary. John.
So he said, we don't like people who are ideological. And I said, we're sitting discussing this in your office under a 6 foot by 6 foot red silk flag of Che Guevara. And he said, that's just decoration. But in those days, Calgary was renowned as a conservative place. The trouble is that the radicals, their long march through the institutions in the humanities these days, very few people get PhDs who aren't themselves radical. So even if they wanted a more balanced faculty, they wouldn't know where to get one. But I don't just want to be negative. I have a simple solution. Privatize the universities. Let them charge full cost for the product they deliver and see who they attract, and see which professors are filling the classrooms. Because, there's a good case for subsidizing, of course, elementary and even secondary education. But post-secondary people capture the benefits. You get a university degree, you make more money, you talk more loudly at parties, you have more social status, all these kind of things. There's really no case for subsidizing it. And people who are worried that those from impoverished backgrounds might not be able to go, we can create voluntary charities to provide scholarships. We're Canadian, we can do this. But stop. Why is the government, of all people, subsidizing this festering hatred of our own civilization, including its system of government?
I agree. So we've got to have those heart-to-hearts with a lot of people, including the premiers of our provinces, that fund these cesspools. I mean, obviously, universities have some great programs and there's some really good people, but there's a lot of faculties that are just utterly compromised. I think of the faculties of education to start off with. I mean, it would just be great to, as you say, privatize them. Basically, don't fund them, don't subsidize them anymore, let alone don't give money to them. I think that's your point, is it not, John?
Yeah, give your own money, right? The great professors, the great programs, they won't have trouble attracting customers. But and I'll say that education to me is a bit like journalism as a academic specialty. It just shouldn't exist. Teachers should be hired because they understand subjects and they've got a natural gift for teaching. It is not something you can spend 4 years perfecting. And in any case, most of the time, what they're doing in those courses is being fed radical ideas, which they came in wanting anyway. It's preposterous that we would, and also, I mean, we need school vouchers. Every time I see some story about idiocy in the public school system, I say, once again, let the state fund for everybody, but let the public dollars follow the students to where the parents put them instead of the students following the money to where the government puts it. It is crazy. And again, you get someone like Doug Ford, who's supposed to be conservative because he's got bad manners and a big belly. Well, that doesn't make you a conservative. You can't interest him in any of this stuff because no philosophical grounding. He doesn't like ideas. He doesn't talk about ideas. And we need to do a lot better in our politics too. I mean, for years I've been asking conservative politicians at every opportunity, what is government doing that it should just stop doing? Not move to a different level, not reorganize, not find some new way of delivering it. What is government doing that it just shouldn't be? And it is astonishing how few of them, despite a decade or more in politics, have thought of anything, even something small. And again, I'd love to get that. Journalists should ask Pierre Poilievre that. What should government just stop doing? What is not appropriately Caesar's? And see what he can list. Maybe he's got ideas. Doug Ford doesn't seem to. He's been in power quite a while. What has he gotten rid of all the useless or obnoxious things that the government does? What has he gotten rid of?
Right on. Just 2 points here, and I do have a question or comment. That would be, I mean, the first thing that strikes me is, again, your principle of empowering individuals to make choices about how they're going to live their lives. So don't give money to the bureaucracy. Give it to the individuals and let them choose. Like if it's a school voucher, gosh, I would think the parents are in the best position to, based on the knowledge of their, their kids, they can make the decisions about where they send their child to best develop and grow. So I like the way you're thinking there, John. I do have a comment. One would be basically Pierre Poilievre. The observation is that Pierre Poilievre doesn't seem to be talking much about immigration. So why do you think that is, John?
Well, Poilievre is a bit too much of a career Laurentian politician. You know, he looks like this ferocious right-winger, and of course the Trudeau Liberals like to portray him that way, and he likes being portrayed that way because it galvanizes his base. But in point of fact, he's extremely cautious about any of the supposed third-rail issues, like repealing the Canada Health Act, for instance, another critically important piece of public policy reform. Getting our defense spending up to 2% of GDP, saying there is no man-made climate crisis, saying that Canada has far too much immigration and that we have this wonderful natural heritage, that Canada is one of the emptiest countries in the world, with spectacular natural scenery, and we don't need to pave it all. A few years back, I took a bus from Guelph to Toronto, and it was just suburban strip malls filled with dentist offices and convenience stores and marijuana shacks the whole way. And I thought, who on earth is of the view that the entire inhabited part of Canada ought to be asphalt and cement. What is wrong with having it still be green and verdant? But Poilievre, like as I say, he's good at sounding grumpily conservative if you're grumpily conservative, but he stays within very safe guardrails in terms of what people thought you could or couldn't say in politics. And I think he's quite wrong about that. And you look at the success, for instance, of the Reform Party in the UK now, there is a lot of room for people who have an appetite for actual change, not just the word change slapped onto the same old, same old.
Okay, so I think you're challenging Pierre Poilievre, the Conservatives. You're challenging everybody, John, to do a better job to get Canada back on track, and I really like that. So one of the things that I find interesting, you've referenced climate policy, because that has, I think, to a larger degree, driven a lot of liberal policies. You think of the so-called carbon tax, all kinds of things. I wanted to share with you a fascinating overview from The Guardian. It's a British paper that talks about climate change as if it's really like the end of the world here. So I wanted to share this with you and get your response. John, I tell you, I like the green illustrations and the cartoons, but to me it seems like a very bleak picture. And that's from the journalists, the so-called journalists at The Guardian. What do you think about that? I mean, I almost feel anxious even watching it.
Yeah, and you should feel anxious because journalism is so terrible these days. Of course, The Guardian is not ever been a publication you should rely on. But, you know, the nonsense in there is coming so thick and fast, it's hard to know where to start. Like pollution, we might have no breathable air by 2050. Rubbish. The air in Western cities is so much cleaner than it was 50 or 100 years ago,
Indeed.
and it's continuing to improve. That's absolute nonsense. The air in China is terrible, but that's because they're run by communists. Or coral's all going to die. Coral evolved millions and millions of years ago in a world much warmer than today. If you want to find coral, where do you go to Baffin Island? Do you say to yourself, I've got to go to Novosibirsk? Good heavens, no. You go to the Caribbean, you go to Australia, where the Great Barrier Reef is actually at its greatest extent since they started measuring it properly. Coral likes warmth. It's one small claim, but it's ridiculous. Or this thing about crop failures. The human population has never been larger. People have never lived longer. There has never been less absolute poverty. Famine, except again in socialist dictatorships, is essentially unknown in the world. Crops aren't failing. Crops like CO2. Crops like warmth. Harvests failed in the Little Ice Age. So this journalist is spewing one idiotic misstatement after another, but without any background, or all the stuff about the weather, right? The floods and the fires and so on. If you look at IPCC reports, these things are not getting worse. Global wildfires are decreasing. There are no global trends in drought
you
or
said
flooding.
global
None of this is happening.
wildfires are decreasing, John?
Yes.
Wildfires
These things are
decreasing.
tracked reasonably carefully, and for decades, not just in North America, but worldwide, fires have been decreasing. But
that's
journalists
not what
don't know
we're
that. They're
hearing.
not lying to you. They're just ignorant, unfit for their jobs, and sanctimonious.
Okay, so let's talk about wildfires, because we hear, like in Quebec as an example, you had a whole range of wildfires that started up. So does that prove that we've got a global climate crisis on our doorstep?
No, it proves that wood is flammable. I mean, the world has always had wildfires. As far as we can tell, they were a lot worse in the 17th and 18th century than they are today. But I mean, you look at 2023, and Canada had a very bad wildfire season. You go, oh, it's global warming, it's global warming. But the United States had a very quiet wildfire season. And last time I looked, they weren't just on the same planet as us. They were next to us on the same continent. So if global warming incinerated Canada, why did it bypass the United States? There's just no logic to it. One thing is that if you have a bunch of quiet years, then of course the fuel load builds up. But generally speaking, again, we have statistics on wildfires in Canada, number of fires, acres burned, going back decades, and the trend line is down. 2023 was an unusual year, but life is full of unusual things. We're not having a bad wildfire season this year. Canada has thousands of wildfires every year. You know, every time there's a fire, it's like, oh, it's climate change. No, it's a fire, right? They're perfectly normal. They happen. Like, remember when the Amazon was on fire, the lungs of the world are burning, and all these celebrities were sending out pictures that weren't from the Amazon and so on? Well, is the Amazon a scorched wasteland? No, of course not. It was just that they had some fires, and a lot of those were people slashing and burning to clear land, and there are reasons for not wanting that to happen. But everything except that we're going to have more anxiety in that Guardian piece was rubbish, including we're going to cut CO2 emissions in half by 2030. That's only 6 years away. These people live in fantasy land. If you look at, despite all the money that governments have spent on these alternatives, and the one they won't touch mostly is nuclear, the world's using more hydrocarbons, more oil, more gas, even more coal, thanks to China, than it was last year and the year before. The total we're using keeps going up. You can't do this without condemning billions of people to death, especially poor people in the third world. That's what would happen if you actually stopped using oil and gas. People would die en masse. And we're going to cut it in half by 2030, cut it in half by 2040, cut it in half by 2050. This is just somebody fantasizing. This has no connection with real world practicalities. And then you get a cleaner world, more room for wildlife because of wind and solar. Look at how big a nuclear plant is, or how big a natural gas plant is, and then look how big a wind farm is or a solar farm. It's ridiculous. Those things eat up space. They produce toxic waste. The raw materials are produced under slave labor conditions in a lot of the world, and it's filthy. They're not cleaner, they're dirtier, and they can't get the job done. And again, I've always said a sanity test for people worried about climate change is support for nuclear power. Because nuclear power, it creates some emissions, of course. Cement is quite emissions intensive, and you got to build the plants. But once you build them, they operate with minimal emissions. Nuclear waste is easy to manage. The horror stories are just made up, and yet they won't do it. And that tells you that there's something very wrong with the way they think about the world, including this belief that, basically wealth is going to fall from the sky, that they're going to just get rid of everything that works and something will replace it, which they will not have any useful role in creating, but somebody else will do it. They don't know who, they don't know how. And it's one crazed enthusiasm after another. Now it's heat pumps. These people they don't think practically at a very deep level, and it's extremely dangerous to give people like that power.
So, gosh, you're really challenging the so-called climate narrative.
Every bit of it.
Every bit of it. I mean, and I think what you're doing is really saying, like, so why has this happened, John? Like, I mean, I know that, let's take windmills and solar panels. I think most of them are subsidized by the government, so it's kind of a subsidy game. And you're right, it doesn't necessarily create a reliable, dependable source of electricity. They're all ultimately based on fossil fuels anyways, as you manufacture metal products to create windmills and all the rest. So is that a solution then, in your mind, as a source of power?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by a solution. There's a place for windmills, as there's a place for solar panels, and I'm sure they will get better over time. But again, windmills are so lethal to birds and insects and so on. They're ecologically very destructive. So they're not, and they cannot produce the power we need at the time that we need it. So they're a part of the picture, but it's a fairly small part of the picture. But the bigger point is there's no climate crisis. I mean, we had this heat last week and people are like, oh, this is the end. The forecast, I think it's for tonight where I live, is 9 degrees Celsius. And where's the attribution science now? There's simply not a huge problem that we need to deal with. Of course, we want to keep improving energy efficiency. Of course, we want to respect nature and make space for it. But what you ask why it happened, and one of the reasons is I think ideas are hugely important. And when I was at graduate school, I read a brilliant book that, of course, was not assigned by one of my professors, Thomas Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions, about these very different philosophical foundations of left and right-wing thinking. And leftists essentially tend inherently to think that there's some terrible calamity that is being caused by leaving people to pursue their own interest, and we must take control. And it's changed from topic to topic. At one point, there was a coming ice age, global overpopulation. There have been a variety of these since I was young. And climate change naturally appealed to these people because it fit the kind of way that they inherently tend to see the world. But the other thing that's going on, and I don't think we should downplay this, is that as the Western world has lost its Christian faith, we haven't been able to get rid of the sense that we are not as we should be, that we are sinners, and that something ominous will happen if we don't repent. And so people who no longer recognize that their own personal failings need the grace of God instead go around crusading against the evil in others, otherwise Gaia will smite us. And so this powerful sense we are sinners, our whole way of life is wrong, we must repent, we must change our ways, or God will send another flood, right? There's all this about sea level rise, the sea levels, and that was in the Guardian video too, they're going to wash away the cities, and you look at actual sea level rise, and it's like, if it went up a meter in a century, it would be astonishing. And if we're still around in a century and we haven't trashed our economies, we can build a wall 1.5 meters high where the ocean meets the city, right? It's not something we can't deal with. And of course, the seas have been rising since the end of the last glaciation, right? Very rapidly at first, and then it tapered off. But the kind of sea level rise that you see today is roughly what you've seen for the last 6,000 years. Okay, there's nothing ominous about it. There's nothing unusual about it. And there's no reason to think it's man-made. And this idea that we're going to see the cities going under is just stupid. It's absolutely stupid. You look at how much sea levels are rising. I mean, the NOAA publishes these, and we've done a series of videos, checking in around the world at places that are looking for the next century. It'll be a foot or it'll be 1.5 feet. And the idea that you've got kids screaming and young people not wanting to have families because the water's going to go up 1 foot in the next 100 years. This is preposterous. How could you be scared of that?
Well, I think you make some stunning points there, John, and I marvel at how basically there's nothing new under the sun here, except perhaps a class of people that are, perhaps they see themselves as the good and the great, and they can tell everybody else what to do.
That's not new. Ask King John. We've had that from time immemorial. And we've developed self-government to stop these people from trampling all over us. But lately, the clever people have been undermining restraints on government. And the result of it is that everybody's unhappy and we've got huge budget deficits, and yet government can't do anything. I mean, none of this would have surprised Sir John A. Macdonald. He was a great believer in limited government. None of this would have surprised Edward Cook. What's surprising is that we're surprised.
Indeed. I like your sense of history there. And certainly, I think you put your thumb on a very important issue, and that is the state is just so huge. It seems like it's too complex and too big that anyone can manage it.
I think that is true. And what's making it worse, my colleague at the National Post, Jamie Sarkanak, wrote a column about the tidal wave of incompetence that is just causing all big bureaucratic systems to crumble. And the school system that we talked about earlier is turning out employees who are neither responsible in the sense of wanting to take responsibility or responsible in the sense of being able to. And then, of course, government bureaucracies with all this DEI, they're deliberately hiring people for reasons other than they might plausibly be able to do their job. And so the bureaucracy is so huge that it's unaffordable, and yet nothing is working, right? You just look around. They can't even, this thing recently, they're trying to produce a new bill to honor King Charles, who is not, and let's be frank, a young man. So it'd be nice to get the bill out there. And the Bank of Canada can't produce this banknote within 4 years, a banknote. Right? World War II in Europe started in 1939, and Canada was disarmed. We had 6 tanks. We had soldiers going about on maneuvers, pointing sticks and shouting bang. And then by 1944, we were some 4th and 5th largest Navy and Air Force in the world, right? Nowadays, they can't produce a banknote in 4 years. Look at Calgary's water system. Look at anything. And the number of scandals that keep erupting because they can't even maintain basic ethical guidelines, not just because they're morally weak, but because they're mentally weak. And so the kids are pouring out of these schools filled with righteous indignation about social justice. They go out chanting from the river to the sea. And if you go out and ask them which river did you meet and which sea, they haven't got a clue. These are the kind of people flooding into governments. No wonder nothing works.
Exactly. So we've covered a lot of ground here. One of the topics I'd like to just touch base on is your sense of what's going on then in these encampments in universities across Canada, where you have a number of people. Some of them are students. I think some of them are actually paid activists. I'm not entirely sure, that are protesting in favor of Hamas. And obviously we want things to move forward in that terrible conflict between Israel and Palestine. But this is really almost an intractable situation where you have Hamas, which I see as very much a kind of a religious death cult, that is seeking to exterminate Israel. How are we to respond then to these kinds of encampments? Like, do they not understand that we are facing a group that does not want to coexist with Israel? Is that similarly how you see that situation?
Yes, I assume there are some of what Lenin called useful idiots in the camps, although I'm not absolutely convinced these people are terribly useful. But there is a much more malevolent side to it. There's a darkness here. I mean, including these people who say, oh, Jews became white in order to become oppressors. And next thing you know, they're into the blood libel. Though I would like to say, I don't think it's a war between Israel and Palestine. There is no such thing as Palestine. And before it became a polemical tool for the Arabs and the Muslims in particular to try and wipe the Jews off the face of the earth, nobody talked about them. These are these refugees from 48 when they were told, get out of the way so we can kill all the Jews and then you can have the land. And then instead they lost the war. And they've kept them bottled up in Gaza in particular ever since. The Arab nations have endless territory and large populations. They could welcome their Palestinian brothers, give them homes, and everything would be fine. But instead, they keep them there because they're malevolently bent on wiping out not just Israel, but the Jews. If you listen to the public discourse in the mosques and in the public papers and so on, in the Middle East, there is no real pretense that it's just about Israel, nor is there going to be a two-state solution. And again, you get to these camps, resistance by any means possible. After what happened on October 7th, and after we knew what had happened on October 7th, including the horrifying sexual sadism and murder, and to say by any means possible to endorse that is to go down a very dark road. And we need to understand that what we are dealing with, it's Moloch and Baal, they're back. And this in some sense is this, as Chesterton's chapter on the war between Rome and Carthage, we really are in some sense still in that conflict. And how did we raise young people who could be at once so ignorant and so malevolent to believe there's a genocide as the Palestinian population in Gaza increased year upon year dramatically? What kind of genocide sees more and more people? The Holocaust is a genocide. And then we just saw this, there's famine in Gaza. So, okay, there's no famine, but anyway, death to Jews. That this is the malevolence of anti-Semitism, the permanence, the viciousness, the virulence of it. It's a very scary force. And that it has infested our young people and our universities is a terrifying sign of how the moral collapse of the West actually is.
And so, John, when you think of universities as an example, I just want to use I think an amazing case study. I've noticed that there's a whole series of research chairs funded by the federal government across the country. The University of Waterloo is a good case in point. I just saw that the other day, where you hire people not based on merit, but based on their identity. So does that not reflect the ideology that these are truly real believers in cultural Marxism, and that in order to do your, quote, discipline in these disciplines, which I don't even think are academic disciplines, you need to be of a certain race or background? Does that not epitomize the insanity of what's going on here?
It seems to me that it does. No, I'm not a big fan of the phrase cultural Marxism because it implies that Marxism is sort of the core and archetype of left-wing thought, and then there's just different kinds. To me, Marxism is just one more left-wing idea focused on the idea that your socioeconomic class shaped your thinking, whereas nowadays it's your race. And if I were someone hired for one of these chairs and they said, you know what, we believe we've done a test of your skin color and we therefore are convinced that you're left wing, I would be horrified. I would be offended. I would be mortified. I would say my skin color has nothing to do with how I think. But yeah, we're deep into identity politics, which is one. And it's a persistent tendency in left-wing thinking over many, many years where it absolves you of individual responsibility. The oppressor is part of a class and they are guilty even if they're innocent, and you are part of a class and you are innocent even if you're guilty. And again, this feeds into anti-Semitism, of course. If the Jew is white, then they must be colonizers in a land where we know the links of the Jewish people to the land of Israel go back thousands of years, and they were in large measure driven out, including by Arab Muslim invaders. So they're the colonizers. And yet they're supposedly, well, they're not white, so they must be indigenous, and Israelis are white, so they can't be indigenous. That kind of thinking, it's both moronic and evil. And that's a terrible combination. And yet I think you would find, especially in humanities faculties nowadays in our universities, it's the dominant view that they really have been captured by people who shouldn't be allowed near our youth. And again, we need to privatize the universities and see if they can peddle poison at its full market value. And my guess is no, they cannot.
Right on. So I did want to shift the topic a little bit to the issue of Aboriginal land acknowledgements. I think you've written about that recently, John. It's interesting how it's fascinating how you can not go to some public events without some type of land acknowledgement being said. There's different versions of them. In fact, some churches have even adopted them. It's really quite astounding. So I wanted to share this kind of tongue-in-cheek discussion around land acknowledgements from the CBC, no less.
Hello. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Oh, sorry, hello? Sorry, excuse me, should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that, or?
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
Oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
Oh, a portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh, no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry, I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats. Have a good time.
But,
Good night.
So sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
Well, there you go. There's a tongue-in-cheek kind of discussion regarding the absurdity of Aboriginal land acknowledgements. What do you think, John? Should we just all get up and leave? What do you think?
I think that it's very important to be consistent and truthful. And so I appreciate that sketch. It doesn't go far enough, and I'll explain why not in a moment. But certainly, if you actually believe that you were on stolen land, then yes, you absolutely have to give it back. It's like if I had your bicycle and said, so this is your stolen bicycle, and I'm really enjoying riding it, I would be a thief and a hypocrite. And I did recently write about this in the Epoch Times, starting out, this is a plagiarized column written on a stolen computer. But it goes further than that, because what they say about the land being unceded, unsurrendered, traditional territory, it's not true. Most of it was ceded. No, I mean, you might not like everything about the way that it was ceded, but there are recognized ways in international law that territories pass from one political entity to another, and the lands in Canada passed to the Crown using those methods. And another thing, it's not as though the various Aboriginal groups were sitting there in peace and harmony for 3,000 years in the same spot until the evil white person came along. On the contrary, many of them were nomads. It was chronic low-scale warfare. Even like, who's in possession of land when Jacques Cartier shows up, and then who's there when Champlain shows up. It's quite different groups. And there is the fact that there was no literate culture before the Europeans came, so that the previous owners aren't able to assert a provable claim to the land. But even look at the Hurons, right? Why did the Hurons end up where they are? Because the Mohawks walloped on them. It wasn't fair. It wasn't nice, and it isn't a legitimate basis for the Mohawks to say, "Give us the land back," and then we're keeping it because we hid the bodies. It just doesn't. It's the whole thing is massively hypocritical. And then you get these memory keepers telling you this prayer is thousands of years old. No, it's not. Oral cultures change. So everything about those acknowledgements is a lie, including that we actually think we stole the land and are going to give it back. And then we do them and feel so good about ourselves. When in fact we should feel awful because we're telling people lies in order to then engage in behavior that is flagrantly hypocritical. It's astonishing that we would do these things. And when you look at all the problems we have in public life and all the difficulties we have and the kind of things that make for solutions, there is, to my mind, one thing that is more important than any other, and it's fairly easy, at least in principle, and anyone can do it. Tell the truth. Never say something that you believe is untrue, and never sit silent when someone else says something that you believe is untrue. These land acknowledgements have got to stop because they are not true. And they make fake promises. If you're an Aboriginal hearing it, you're thinking, hey, we're getting the land back. It's like, oh, no, like the old Hollywood movie cliche, right? Where some particular act of perfidy takes place and then some stone-faced elder says, white man speak with forked tongue, right? All these land acknowledgements are forked tongue because nobody's planning to give it back. And that is, I think the CBC's bang on. Again, they act as though we actually should give it back, which I don't think is true either, because then you'd have to give it back to someone who'd have to give it back to somebody else, and you'd never, ever trace it all out. And it's not unceded. It's not unsurrendered. There may be bits and pieces, and if so, go to the courts. But most of it, that's just not true. So the whole thing is a monstrous pyramid of lies and hypocrisy, and you cannot build a just society on lies and hypocrisy.
I think you're right. We try to strive for the truth when it comes to our civilization. So again, you are challenging us, John, to speak the truth. So in this case, why are people doing this? Is it because they seek kind of they're genuflecting to some kind of wokeness where they feel good about it? Or is it kind of a money grab where people want endless compensation and it never ends? What's going on here then from your perspective?
I think there's a range of motives. Certainly there is an industry around this stuff, but there's also a profound sense of guilt. The collision between European and Aboriginal culture was very one-sided, and it had calamitous effects, including demographic, and people wish it hadn't happened. But you can't change it just by wishing it hadn't happened. And then I think there's also this sort of revolt of the elites against Western society. Well, they will believe any tripe about pre-European civilizations in the Americas. I mean, I was just at this thing where there was the story about the creator and how she decided to create man. And if you're expecting me to believe that Aboriginals prior to European conduct were monotheists who thought God was a woman, then you are so far out to lunch that it's very hard to know where to start. And I think a lot of people are just bullied. I think a lot of people are sitting there knowing this is rubbish and hating it, but not daring to say anything. And somebody said about communism that if everybody just told the truth for one day, communism would have collapsed. And I think it's time, I said, tell the truth, but also do not acquiesce in a lie. You have to do both parts. When you hear something you know is false from a politician or a bureaucrat or anybody else, don't sit there lest you be singled out for ridicule. Be polite, certainly. Don't fly those beat Trudeau flags. I think those are terrible, putting those up in front of kids. But stand up and say, no, that's not true, and I will not live a lie. Or, these syncretic Aboriginal prayers that have been conjured up. If you don't believe that this is a true religion, don't sit there while they do that and don't say the Lord's Prayer. It is, there's religion. If one religion is true, others are not true. And to sit there pretending to believe in this, I mean, again, Stone Age people, I don't care where they live. My ancestors, your ancestors, everybody's ancestors were polytheists and animists. They were not monotheists. They didn't have a conception of Turtle Island. None of that is true. Don't sit there while people say things that are not true and make you smile, because that is the soft totalitarianism in action. Tell the truth and do not sit silent when you hear a lie.
Well, that strikes me as great advice, John, that as citizens we have an obligation to try to speak the truth and not acquiesce to those who do not speak the truth, to have that kind of healthy, respectful debate. So, John, it has been a pleasure to have you join us for this discussion. We've certainly covered a lot of very important topics. And one of the things that strikes me about you, John, is not only your analytical mind, but your courage and leadership. So thank you so much, John, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
So that comes to the end of our program today. Please be sure to join us next week on Thursday. And we're so glad that you could pose a number of questions to our guest today, and look forward to seeing you next week.